A disabled girl thought the diner was her safe place until Bullies turned it into a nightmare. But 20 minutes later, the roar of engines shook the windows. And what walked through that door changed everything. Welcome back to our channel. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more amazing stories every week. The bell above the diner door jingled faintly as it swung shut, sealing in the comforting scent of bacon sizzling on the griddle and coffee brewing in endless cycles. It was one of those small-town diners that seemed untouched by time-read vinyl booths, chrome-edged tables, and faded pictures of old county fairs hanging crooked on the walls. For most people, this was a place to relax, to laugh over pancakes, or to sip coffee until the waitress came by with a fresh pot. For her, it was supposed to be a safe place. She was a quiet girl, no more than 14, with long brown hair that slipped forward as she hunched over her milkshake. Her crutches leaned awkwardly against the booth, clattering once when she shifted. A metal brace hugged her leg from thigh to ankle, catching the harsh fluorescent light overhead. She wasn't used to stairs anymore. She had grown up with them. Endured the whispers at school, the pitying looks from adults who didn't know what to say. But she had hoped here, in this little diner, she could disappear into the background for once. The problem was that she wasn't invisible. Not tonight. Across the room, a group of 4 teenagers sat crowded into a booth, their laughter carrying louder than it should have. They were older than her, maybe 17 or 18, the type that liked to let the whole world know they existed. They weren't laughing at anything fun. Anyone could see that. Their eyes darted toward her between their fits of forced laughter, and she knew what was coming before the first cruel words even left their mouths. "Hey, look," one of them muttered, his voice just loud enough to travel. "It's Tiny Tim," the others snickered. Her shoulders hunched lower. She told herself not to react, not to give them anything. If she just stayed quiet, maybe they'd lose interest. She had played this game before, but Bullies never needed much to feed on. Another boy leaned forward, smirking as he jabbed his friend in the ribs. What's she even doing here? Can she even eat without help? The table erupted in laughter. It was forced, sharp, like knives scraping against plates. The girl gripped her straw tighter, forcing herself to sip her milkshake, pretending she couldn't hear. Pretending her ears weren't burning. The waitress at the counter glanced over, her brows knitting, but she didn't say anything. Nobody did. That was how it usually went. People didn't like getting involved. The cruel whispers grew bolder, louder. They wanted her to hear, and then suddenly one of the boys stood. He was taller than the others, broad-shouldered with that cocky slouch of someone who had never once been told no. He sauntered across the diner, each heavy step echoing on the tile. He stopped right at her booth. She froze. For a moment, she hoped he might just walk by. But then his hand shot out, quick as a whip, and slapped the milkshake from her hand. The glass hit the edge of the table, exploded onto the floor, and splattered sticky pink streaks across her shoes. The entire diner gasped. Forks froze halfway to mouths. The hiss of the griddle suddenly felt unbearably loud in the silence that followed. She stared at the mess dripping down her leg brace, too stunned to move. The boy sneered. "Oops," he drawled, his voice thick with mockery. Guess that hand wasn't fast enough to hold it. His friends at the booth howled with laughter. One of them cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Careful, she might trip over air on the way out." And then it happened, the thing that cut deeper than any spilled milkshake ever could. Another boy, thinner, but with a mean streak burning in his eyes, strode over, leaned down, and slapped her cheek with an open hand. Not hard enough to knock her over, but enough to sting, to humiliate, to leave a mark. Her breath caught in her throat. The sound of the slap cracked through the diner like a whip. Tears welled instantly, hot and blinding, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. "What's the point of someone like you coming here?" The boy sneered. His breath smelled of fries and arrogance. "You don't belong. You never will." That was when the shame hit, not because of his words, but because of the silence that followed. A room full of adults, a room full of people who knew better, and not one of them stood up. Not one voice said, "That's enough." They all watched, eyes averted, hearts beating a little faster, but hands glued to the tables. Fear held them hostage. The girl sat frozen, her face burning, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every part of her wanted to vanish. To sink through the booth and disappear forever, the bullies laughed, strutting back to their booth like conquering heroes. They tossed crumpled napkins at her as they went, little insults wrapped in greasy paper. They didn't even finish their food, they just laughed their way out the door. Proud of what they had done, the bell jingled cheerfully as they left. Mocking the silence they left behind, she wiped at her cheek with the back of her hand, but the sting lingered. She didn't cry. She wouldn't cry in front of them. But her hands shook as she pulled her crutches closer. As if holding on to them could somehow anchor her, the diner exhaled collectively once the bullies were gone. But no one looked at her directly. No one dared. The waitress brought her a fresh milkshake, set it on the table gently, almost apologetically. But the girl couldn't touch it. Her appetite was gone. She just sat there in the corner booth, staring at the spilled milkshake still dripping onto the tile, wondering why the world always seemed so eager to remind her that she didn't belong. And outside, the sun sank lower, the light fading an hour that felt heavier than a lifetime. The girl sat in the booth, still shaken, the remains of her ruined milkshake, now cleaned from the floor, but still staining her memory. The waitress had offered her another, free of charge, but the glass sat untouched. She kept her head down, eyes fixed on the table's chrome edge, her fingers tracing meaningless patterns. Every time she blinked, she felt the sting of that slap all over again, like an echo she couldn't silence. The quiet hum of the diner felt suffocating now, the clink of dishes, the murmur of conversation, each sound a reminder that life moved on while she was left behind, invisible, yet painfully exposed. Time seemed to drag, each minute crawling by heavier than the last. She checked the clock above the counter, wishing she could disappear into its ticking hands. Maybe if she waited long enough, the shame would fade. Maybe if she sat still enough, people would forget what had happened. But she knew they wouldn't. The silence of those who had watched and done nothing screamed louder than the bullies. Laughter than it happened. The low, throaty growl of engines cut through the afternoon like thunder rolling in from a distance. One engine at first, then another, then a chorus of them. The sound grew louder, closer, until it filled the diner's thin glass windows with a trembling vibration. Heads lifted. Conversations stilled. Even the cook behind the grill leaned forward, spatula paused in midair. Outside, sunlight glinted off chrome as motorcycles roared into the parking lot one after another. They weren't the shiny showroom kind. These were machines that had lived. Engines that carried scars and dust from highways most of the diner's customers had never dared to drive. The parking lot filled with leather jackets, boots, helmets glinting like battle armor. The girl looked up from her booth, curiosity pulling her from her haze of shame. For the first time in an hour, her thoughts weren't on the slap or the laughter or the ruined milkshake. They were on the rumble outside. The diner door swung open with a jingle that suddenly sounded far too delicate. The first man to walk in was tall, broad, with a heavy beard that framed a face carved by years on the road. His leather vest was covered in patches, each one a story untold. Behind him, half a dozen more bikers filed in, their presence filling the small diner like a storm cloud. Their boots thudded on the tile, their voices low and rough as they claimed a corner of the room. People shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to be nervous or relieved. A group of bikers walking into a diner could mean trouble. But the girl's eyes stayed locked on the leader. He hadn't sat down yet. His gaze moved slowly across the room, scanning, searching. When his eyes landed on her, he paused. He saw everything in a glance, the crutches leaning against her booth. The milkshake left untouched, the redness swelling faintly on her cheek. His expression changed almost imperceptibly, softening where others might have hardened. He walked over. Each step was deliberate, the weight of his boots echoing. The diner hushed to silence again. All eyes followed him as he knelt beside the girl's booth, bringing himself level with her. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice deep but steady. Surprisingly gentle for a man who looked like he'd fought storms on highways. "Who did this to you?" Her lips parted, but no words came at first. No one had asked her that. No one had cared enough to. She had expected pity from the waitress, discomfort from the diners, maybe whispers when she left. But this man wasn't pitying her. He was asking her, as though her answer mattered, as though her voice had weight. She swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she twisted them together in her lap. She whispered the names. Quiet, almost afraid to let them escape. The biker nodded once, his jaw tightening. Behind him, his crew exchanged glances, unspoken communication sparking in their eyes. They didn't need explanations. They didn't need to know what had happened in every detail. They could see the truth written across the girl's face. The leader placed a hand gently on the edge of the table, steadying himself as he leaned closer. "You don't worry," he said, his voice firm, carrying across the diner without being loud. "We'll take care of it." And then, just as calmly as they had entered, the bikers stood and walked back to the door. Their boots pounded in rhythm, their vests swaying, their presence like a tide rolling back out to sea. The engines outside roared to life, the sound shaking the windows once again. The diners erupted into whispers the second the door closed. Nobody said the words out loud, but everyone thought the same thing. They're going after those boys. The girl sat frozen, heart racing, unsure what she had just set into motion. A part of her was terrified. Terrified of what the bikers might do. Terrified of what would happen if the bullies found out she had spoken their names. But another part of her, the part that had shrunk smaller and smaller inside her chest all afternoon, suddenly felt a flicker of warmth. Someone believed her. Someone cared enough to act. She lifted her hand to her cheek. The sting still faint, but now dulled by something new-hope. Half an hour passed, but it felt like a lifetime. The girl stared at the door, waiting, wondering. The other diners kept glancing out the window, some nervous, some almost excited. Even the waitress, who had been so hesitant before, kept refilling coffee cups with shaking hands, her eyes darting to the parking lot. The air in the diner was thick, expectant, like everyone was holding their breath. And then, faint at first, the engines returned. The thunder rolled closer until it rattled the plates on the tables. The girl's heart pounded as the motorcycles filled the parking lot once again. She straightened in her seat, her crutches pressed close against her side. Eyes wide and unblinking, the door swung open, and this time, the bikers weren't alone. The bell above the door jingled again, and the diner seemed to inhale all at once. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Every pair of eyes turned toward the entrance, where the bikers filled the doorway like shadows stretching into the room. But it wasn't just them this time. Behind the leather-clad figures stood the four boys, the bullies from earlier. Their cocky swagger was gone, replaced with pale, stiff faces that looked as if they'd seen ghosts. Their clothes were rumpled, their hair windswept. Their eyes darting nervously around the diner as though searching for an escape that didn't exist. Two of the bikers had a firm hand clamped on the shoulders of the tallest boys, steering them forward like misbehaving children. The air grew heavy. The girl's breath caught in her chest. She gripped her crutches so hard her knuckles whitened. She couldn't believe it. These were the same boys who had strutted out earlier, laughing at her pain. Now they were being marched back in, humbled, trembling. Their pride stripped bare. The leader stepped forward, towering behind them. His voice rolled through the diner like thunder. "You've got something to say to her?" The boys shifted uncomfortably, eyes glued to the floor. One of them tried to mumble something, but the biker beside him gave a firm nudge that nearly toppled him forward. "Say it loud," the leader barked, his tone sharp enough to slice the silence. The tallest boy swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. Finally, he muttered, "We're sorry." The biker raised an eyebrow. "Sorry for what?" The boy's face flushed red, his jaw trembling. "Sorry for hitting you, for messing with you. We shouldn't have done it." His voice cracked, and the others, one by one, echoed him. Each apology was shaky, forced out like a confession, but they were spoken, words the girl never thought she'd hear. The girl sat frozen, her wide eyes locked on them. She hadn't realized until that moment just how badly she'd wanted to hear those words, not because they erased the pain, but because they proved something. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't worthless. What happened to her mattered. The leader crouched beside her again, the way he had earlier, his beard brushing against his vest as he leaned close. "Do you accept their apology?" he asked, not softly but firmly, as though her answer carried weight. For the first time that day, she felt power in her own voice. She looked straight at the boys, their faces pale and nervous, and nodded once. "I accept," she said quietly. The leader stood, his presence towering over the bullies. He pointed a thick finger at them. "You ever lay a hand on her? Or anyone like her again? You'll answer to us. And I promise you, boys, you won't like that answer." The boys nodded furiously, their fear finally visible for all to see. The entire diner seemed to exhale in relief, the tension dissolving into something electric. A wave of murmurs and whispers spread across the room, and then suddenly applause erupted. It wasn't polite clapping. It was loud, raw, full-throated. Every person who had sat in silence earlier, too afraid to act, now stood clapping, some even cheering. The sound filled the diner, bouncing off the chrome and glass, rattling the bullies more than the bikers ever could. The boys shrank under the weight of it all. Their humiliation was complete, not from fists, but from being forced to stand exposed in the very place they'd tried to dominate. The bikers didn't bask in the applause. They simply stood firm, silent protectors whose presence spoke louder than any cheer. The leader motioned, and the boys shuffled awkwardly toward the exit, their heads low. The crew followed, guiding them out like shadows vanishing into daylight. But before he left, the leader turned one last time. He walked back to the booth, leaned down so only the girl could hear, and placed a heavy, warm hand on the table beside her. "Don't ever forget this," he said, his voice steady, his eyes locked on hers. "You're stronger than you think, and there will always be people in this world who have your back. Even when it feels like you're alone, you're not." Her throat tightened, and for a moment she couldn't speak. All she could do was nod, her eyes shining with tears that finally didn't feel like shame. The leader gave her the faintest smile before standing tall again. With a nod to the room, he and his crew walked out. The engines roared to life moments later, their sound fading into the distance like thunder rolling away after a storm. Inside the diner, people returned to their seats, the buzz of conversation loud and alive. But something had changed. The silence of fear that had hung heavy an hour ago was gone, replaced with something new: respect, courage, even a touch of awe. The girl sat back in her booth, her crutches resting against her side. She finally picked up the fresh milkshake the waitress had left her earlier. She took a slow sip, and it tasted sweeter than anything she had ever had before. For the first time that day, she smiled. Not a forced smile, not a shy smile, a real one. And in that diner, in that small corner booth with a milkshake in her hands, she realized something powerful. Sometimes the world doesn't just take from you. Sometimes it gives back in ways you never expect. Thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories.